folks, everybody sing. Now when the saints go marching in, there is a house in New Orleans. Pumped a lot of pain down in New Orleans.
We took a little bacon and we took a little beans and we caught the bloody British in a town in New Orleans.
Yes, I want to be in that number. When the saints go marching in.
Welcome back to the History of New Orleans. We last left off with the election of Charles Waterman to the office of Mayor of New Orleans in 1856. Waterman belonged to the American Party, or the Know-Nothings, a political faction outside the Democrats and Whigs who had contested the highest office in the city for over 40 years. Waterman and the Know-Nothings slid their way into prominence during this time, largely due to the collapse of the Whig Party both locally and nationally. The internal contradictions surrounding slavery had vaporized the party, allowing the Know-Nothings and their rivals, the Republicans, to step into the vacuum. The Republicans were staunchly anti-slavery, and so they held very little sway in southern states, where the Democratic Party reigned supreme. The Know-Nothings, on the other hand, were more flexible on the slavery issue, representing both pro- and anti-slavery positions as long as they were sufficiently anti-immigrant. This allowed the American Party to make inroads in the South, including our subject of New Orleans, where they hijacked the growing reform movement to get their slate of candidates elected in 1856, though not without a little violent election interference. Now, admittedly, these last couple of episodes have been a bit heavy on the politics and economics of New Orleans, while neglecting the cultural changes that were happening in the city, but that has been for a reason. The antebellum period, that being the years between the War of 1812 and the American Civil War, or 1812 to 1861, was the greatest period of economic development in New Orleans' history, while also being one of great political change, as America struggled to establish its national character. Would it be a country of free men, as the writings of the founders would suggest, or would it succumb to the pressures of the slavocracy and become a country of hypocrites? The face of the idealized, more perfect union had not yet been chosen by the year 1861, and nowhere were the contradictions more apparent than in New Orleans, with the largest concentration of free black people in the country, as well as being the central hub for the slave trade. And so a discussion of the politics and economics of New Orleans during this period was of utmost importance to understand not just the historical trajectory of the city, but also of the nation. That is not to say there weren't great cultural and artistic accomplishments in the city during this period that should be overlooked. History is not a patchwork fabric with sections that can clearly be defined from one another. It is a single tapestry with no clear beginnings and endings. Each event bleeds into the next over and over. This is most clearly felt in culture. None of us are separate from our history. We are influenced by those that came before us, and so in some way, everything that is new has a piece of the old within it. The music and art of New Orleans may seem completely different when you compare something made in 1740 and something made in 1840. But we can very clearly trace back each facet of the culture to its roots to see that it is all one part of the great New Orleans tradition and even further beyond. If you asked a person of color in 1820 where he went to hear music and dance, he would probably say Congo Square. But by 1861, the square no longer existed in this capacity. But the bambulas and the banzas could still be heard in New Orleans. The dances to the music played at Congo Square could still be seen performed on the streets of the city. The tradition had not disappeared, even though it had lost its geographic home. This is all to say that while the antebellum period was one of great change, it was also one of continuity, of continuation of the past into the present. A prime example of both the continuity of New Orleans culture and its breakout into the global zeitgeist is the descendant of Saint-Domingan Creole refugees, Louis Gottschalk. He was born in the Crescent City and grew up hearing the rhythms of Congo Square in the 1830s. As it so happened, he also grew up to be a virtuoso piano player and composer. He would leave the city in 1842 to pursue a musical career in Paris, where his talent would be recognized by the likes of Franz Liszt and Frédéric Chopin. Gottschalk weaved the unique sound of New Orleans into the contemporary classical scene with pieces like Bamboula and La Savane. While we can appreciate this mixing of cultures today, Gottschalk was often ostracized by the establishment because of where he came from. Yet that did not stop him from proudly representing himself as the New Orleanian. He was, after all, a child of the city, tied inexorably to its musical tradition. Another child of New Orleans that gained international renown during this period was Paul Morphy. He was an example of New Orleans' unique ethnic mixture, as his father was of Spanish and Irish descent, and his mother was Creole. Young Paul made a name for himself in the city as a chess prodigy, beating opponents with decades more experience than him. As New Orleans became a truly international city during the 1840s, it gave Morphy a chance to play some of the greatest chess players in the world when they visited the Crescent City. These included Hungarian and French chess masters, as well as General Winfield Scott when he passed through the city on his way to fight in the Mexican-American War. When he was older, Morphy brought his chess talent to Europe, where he astonished everyone with his aggressive, fearless style. His exploits in Europe earned him the informal title of Chess Master of the World. His dominance was so complete that he refused to play anyone without evening the odds by sacrificing the first move as well as one of his pieces before the match even started. Ultimately, it would be a short stint in Europe for Morphy, as after 3 years he moved back to New Orleans to begin his law career. It is at this point that the historical record of him falls off, since as brilliant of a chess player as he was equally as mediocre a lawyer. He died in New Orleans at the age of 47, having refused to play in any official chess matches for the last 20 years of his life. Gottschalk and Morphy are just two examples among many of the cultural ambassadors of New Orleans during the antebellum period, and it would be impossible to cover them all, or even to cover more than just the surface level of the intricate evolution of New Orleans' art during even this limited time frame. Just keep in mind that when you walk the streets of New Orleans today, and you hear some jazz music pouring out of a bar, just know that the musician is looking back to the great musicians of Storyville, who are looking back to the great musicians of Congo Square, who are looking back to the great musicians of Africa, and so many more. Can we separate the art of today from the art of years past? No. Just as we cannot separate the cultural changes from the political and economic changes. History is a tapestry, and no part can be separated from the whole. So we then must return to the discussion of politics and economics in New Orleans in 1856. When the Waterman administration took office in this year, it was fortunate enough to be during another high point in the meteoric rise of New Orleans. The Panic of 1837 had slowed the city's progress for years, but by now that was a distant memory. The troubles of the late 1840s and the early 1850s, those dealt with by Mayor Crossman, were also now fading into the past. By now the city was raking in upwards of $100 million a year in trade. It saw growth in all of its most important industries: cotton, sugar, tobacco, and of course slaves. The people of New Orleans felt like celebrating all this prosperity, and what better way to celebrate than with one of the city's greatest cultural touchstones, the Mardi Gras Parade. As it so happens, 1857 was the year that saw the first Mardi Gras Parade. Well, technically, New Orleans had seen its first parade in 1833 under the patronage of local planter and politician Bernard Marini, but the one held in 1857 was the first instance of the now ubiquitous cruise, putting together a parade with floats and ending with a private ball. Crew Comus was founded in 1853 by Anglo-Americans in Uptown and is the progenitor of all modern-day crews that still operate in New Orleans. Mardi Gras celebrations had been going on in New Orleans basically from the beginning, but the parade conceptualized by Marini and brought forth by Crew Comus was the embodiment of the party spirit that New Orleans was steeped in. During this time of good fortune for the city, spirits were high, the party was rocking, and there was a general air of optimism circulating around. Underneath the surface, however, there were forces, both economic and political, at work, that were already sowing the seeds of New Orleans' fall from grace. Another curious characteristic of history is that nothing happens suddenly. We may feel in the moment surprised by the turn of events, but in boiling down everything to cause and effect, we can see that the causes of any great historical surprise often go back years or even decades. They may not be obvious, but these causes were always there, slowly building until the effect comes and smacks us upside the head. As New Orleans was experiencing the height of its age, it was desirable to look back at the causes of such great prosperity with pride. New Orleanians could look back to the auspicious founding of their city at the mouth of the great Mississippi River as the greatest factor in their current day success. The trade had flowed up and down said river for a century and a half, making this little colonial backwater built in a swamp the fourth largest city in America and one of its richest. The cotton gin and Etienne de Boer's sugar processing method made the plantation economy of the state of Louisiana possible, bolstering the economy even more, and we cannot forget that most pivotal and most shameful feather in New Orleans' cap, its position as a central hub for the slave trade in the American South. In today's money, the business of slavery was worth billions, and New Orleans was integral to its success. However, the era of optimism clouded everyone's vision of the past. They only saw what great things had led to their beneficial situation, and not the things that could possibly lead to its ruin. So while business was booming, it was also being siphoned away. The Erie Canal was constructed in 1825, and it connected, somewhat roundabout, the prosperous Ohio River Valley with the greatest port city in America, New York. All of the trade from the Ohio Valley had previously gone down the Mississippi to New Orleans, but now it could forego the great artery of America and head to New York. The longer journey was worth it because the Mississippi is notoriously difficult to navigate with its plethora of sandbars and snags. The tapering off of Ohio's trade went unnoticed in New Orleans because the amount of goods they sold actually increased in the period from 1830 to 1850, but at a much reduced rate of increase than previous decades. Canals were not the only thing cutting into New Orleans' dominance over trade during this period. Railroads were the crowning invention of the industrial age. Just think, the first evidence we have of settled human civilizations was in Mesopotamia, somewhere around 4000 BC. These first settlements all understood the importance of waterways, and all subsequent civilizations would be built around water. Water was not only important for washing, drinking, and growing crops, but also for transportation and trade. Then, nearly 6,000 years later, humans would finally invent something that could challenge the power of a river. Railroads were rivers of steel that could cut through mountains and across gorges, connecting any place to the circulatory system of trade. A few forward-thinking men like Mayor Crossman in New Orleans recognized this. They knew how important the river was to them, but if they did not get in with the modern times, they would be left behind in a world that now ran to the time of the train conductor. Unfortunately, they were not forward-thinking enough. They, like most other contemporary observers, saw the benefits of railroad as a limited operation over relatively short distances. It was mainly used in these days to connect towns and cities that were just outside the range of the traditional trade routes to the waterways. In a sense, railroads were first conceived as an aid to water-based civilization, rather than its usurper. There was no great railroad system. They were all disconnected in short distance. So while Waterman continued the work of previous administrations by having the city invest $3 million into the New Orleans, Jackson, and Great Northern Railroad Company, he and everyone else missed the $60 million Transcontinental Railroad, and likewise the railroad missed New Orleans. A new day was dawning in America, and New Orleans was standing alone out in the cold. But nobody knew that yet. It was 1857, business was good, the party was going strong. What could possibly go wrong? Well, there was one aspect of life in New Orleans that people couldn't help but notice was turning quite sour at this point in time: politics. Now, before we forget, politics, specifically party politics, was a relatively new phenomenon in the history of New Orleans. It had been less than 50 years since the first mayor was chosen by ballot rather than appointed by the governor, who was himself an unelected official. With the introduction of democracy, naturally factions emerged from groups with competing interests. Up until around 1846, this political competition was fought with a fair amount of decorum. The rivalry between the Democratic faction and the Whig faction was never so serious that the two sides couldn't just hash out their differences over a nice bowl of gumbo or a visit to the French Opera House. This respectable attitude was helped by the fact that the Whigs, the dominant party in Louisiana and New Orleans leading up to 1846, pursued a policy agenda that was amenable to both the Creole elites in New Orleans and the broader population of Anglo-American planters. It was the annexation of Texas that drove a fatal wedge between the civilized parties. If you recall, the two parties were split on the issue of Texas, with the Louisiana Whigs against its admittance into the Union, mostly because it would disrupt the sugar market, while the Democrats supported its inclusion because many of their Anglo-American friends and family had already moved to Texas. However, the disagreement alone was not enough to shake up politics. The Whigs were still firmly entrenched in both New Orleans and the rest of the state, so no matter how much of a stink the Democrats made, there would be no movement on the issue. So how does an opposition party exercise their prerogative over the ruling party? Through winning power in elections, of course. As the fissure between the parties widened, the desperation to win these key elections broke down the unspoken political rules of etiquette. Both sides now looked for underhanded ways in which to tip the scales in their favor as the all-important presidential election of 1844 rolled around. The Whigs packed the voting booths by issuing licenses for carriage owners to their supporters. These licenses were enough proof of identity to vote, and the existence of said carriages was not investigated. As fraudulent and sneaky as this strategy was, it was not nearly as organized and effective as the Democratic strategy. The Democratic strategy showed that their party had a better understanding of the actual mechanisms of the election. It wasn't about votes, it was about precincts. You could outnumber your opponent in the city of New Orleans 1,000 to 1, but if all this advantage was concentrated in one precinct, then the rest would go to the other side and the state would flip. You didn't have to register to vote in your home precinct, so the Democrats spread their votes out, narrowly flipping the city and the rest of the state to the Democratic Party, and breaking the status quo that had ruled New Orleans and Louisiana for decades. This was the breaking point, as the Democrats used their new position to pass the 1845 state constitution, which solidified their hold over political power for the next 20 years. It was also the breaking point in the sense that the de facto agreed upon standards and practice of party politics were eradicated. From here on out, it would be a slippery slope as each side resorted to more and more drastic measures in order to one-up the other. All of it would culminate in what we discussed at the end of the last episode, the 1854 rise of the Know-Nothings under the shadow of murderous violence at the voting booths. The political climate in America leading up to the Civil War was undeniably a raging inferno. The heat drove everyone in the country into a mad hysteria, where they would throw themselves off the closest political cliffside. It was an era of extremes. The Know-Nothings were extremely anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant. The Democrats were extremely pro-slavery. The Republicans were extremely anti-slavery, but not to the extent of John Brown. Violence was becoming the norm. It was fair to say that slavery had broken the mind and soul of the nation, and it would soon break its body. But just before that happened, in Louisiana in 1856, it seemed like everyone stopped at this cliff's edge, looked around, and asked themselves what exactly they were doing. 1856 was the crest of the Know-Nothing wave. Their electoral victories in 1854 and 1855 brought them out of the shadows that they had used to sneak their way into prominence. But now that they were under the spotlight, Louisianians began questioning why they had even supported these people. Half the state, and more than half of New Orleans, was Catholic, and the Know-Nothings were avowed anti-Catholics. They had tried to soften their rhetoric to maintain support in the state, but the 1856 election saw the Democrats sweep back into power. However, the intimidation tactics of the Know-Nothings worked better at condensed urban locations like New Orleans, where they kept their fragile hold on power. Now that the Democrats were back in charge of the state government, they teed off against the last few remaining Know-Nothings in office, those in New Orleans, that is. Democratic Governor Robert Wickliffe made it clear from the very beginning of his administration that the intimidation and violence that had accompanied the last few elections in New Orleans would not continue. He lamented in his 1857 address to the legislature that nearly one-third of the voters of New Orleans have been deterred from exercising their highest and most sacred prerogatives. Notice how he specified voters, not citizens, as the voting population of New Orleans at this time was still just a tiny fraction of the whole. He did not lament the great mass of people who were unable to exercise their highest and most sacred prerogatives because of laws that forbade them on grounds of race, gender, or class. But he did have a point that it was not healthy for a democracy if elections could be determined not by popular consensus, but which side was willing to use more violence and force to get their way. To fix this, the legislature established the Office of Superintendent of Elections for the parish of Orleans. This was the only parish in the state that would have this office overseeing its elections, showing how unique of a case New Orleans was compared to its neighbors. It would be totally useless if this superintendent acted as a simple observer of the rules of the electorate, and so the legislature vested the power to appoint deputies to the office. In essence, this would allow the superintendent to build his own private police force for the purpose of defending the polls from the gangs of know-nothings, or any other group for that matter. This was a lot of power to hand over to an unelected person, but the desperate times in New Orleans called for extreme action. Who was trustworthy enough to be handed this supremely powerful position and to execute the will of the state government in New Orleans' elections? The obvious choice was Judge John B. Cotton. Cotton had made a name for himself when he presided over one of the cases of election fraud in 1856. During this case, he had shown bravery in the face of armed know-nothings occupying the court, and had ruled in favor of the Democratic candidate, who alleged that the election was fraudulent on the account that the know-nothings had destroyed a ballot box containing 900 uncounted votes. What was most important about Cotton, at least in the eyes of the legislature, was not that he was impartial, though as a justice of the court he probably should have been, but that he had the backbone to stand up to the know-nothing intimidation. This would come in handy in his new position as superintendent, as there were a few times when he was menaced by a know-nothing mob, and one such gang even made their way to his house one night, attempting to kill him. While Cotton personally showed himself to be a bulwark against know-nothing antics, the situation was quickly slipping out of his control. His jurisdiction extended only to the protection of elections, but there was a much more serious issue plaguing New Orleans in the summer of 1858. It was an election year, and while public opinion towards the election was characterized by widespread apathy, the citizenry was becoming increasingly perturbed at the prevalence of violent crime in the city. The rise of the know-nothings and their reputation for violence seeped out of the containment of the elections and began influencing the character of the city. More and more immigrants were reporting being assaulted in the streets. More and more immigrants were showing up to the hospital with knife wounds or even gunshot wounds. In one case, an Irish immigrant was even set upon in his own home, where his assailants eventually dragged him out into the streets and murdered him. The legitimization of anti-immigration sentiment created by the election of the know-nothings had emboldened vigilantes to enact these cruel acts on innocent people, and this caused those who were outside the know-nothing coalition to begin closing ranks. The Creole community had never really held common cause with the immigrants. They represented the middle and upper classes of New Orleans, while the immigrants were as a whole poor and working class. But now they had a shared enemy, the Americans, specifically those Anglo-Americans who held nativist sentiments. In March of 1858, the Creoles and immigrants, and any citizen who now felt unsafe walking the streets of New Orleans, decided to take action against these nefarious actors. They created a secret society called the Vigilance Committee and began arming themselves. The committee was modeled after a vigilante group that had formed in 1856 in San Francisco to fight widespread political corruption in that city. Likewise, the New Orleans Committee's stated goal was to do what Superintendent Cotton was supposed to be doing, ensuring the safety of the elections and deterring the violence that had occurred in 1854 and 1856. They did not represent a political platform, and they weren't expressly anti-know-nothing. They didn't care who got elected, as long as it was done fairly, without interference. It was ironic that there was so much drama surrounding the proceedings of the elections, when the elections themselves were regarded largely with indifference. There was a small faction of dissident politicians that opposed the know-nothings, but the Democratic Party didn't even have a candidate on the ballot, so this resistance didn't really have an organized political body to gather under. It seemed like the know-nothings would have no reason to employ their intimidation tactics this year, as many of their candidates ran unopposed. However, There was one point of contention that drew the attention of even the most apathetic New Orleans citizen. This was the mayoral race between Know-Nothing Gerald Stith and nominally independent Major P.G.T. Beauregard. Stith was representing the Know-Nothings, after Mayor Waterman had a falling out with the party and refused to stand for re-election. Major Beauregard was put forward by the minority opposition faction and became the figurehead for the anti-Know-Nothing camp. The mere mention of Beauregard as a candidate for mayor ignited the Know-Nothing hooligans, and on June 1st they marched into the office of Registrar of Voters to prevent Beauregard from being included on the ballots. Unbeknownst to the Know-Nothings, this was all that was needed to provoke the Secret Vigilance Committee into action. On the 2nd of June, the decision was made that the safety of the elections was in danger, and a move would have to be made to change this. On the morning of June the 3rd, the sun rose over a New Orleans that was remarkably different to the one that had existed the day before. During the previous night, a large detachment of committeemen made their way to Jackson Square. They occupied the Cabildo and distributed the arms stored in its armory amongst themselves. Cannons were rolled out into the square, and barricades were constructed on all the streets. It was a scene straight out of Les Miserables. To the casual observer, it must have seemed like there was a state of revolution in New Orleans. Except the Vigilance Committee was not seeking to overthrow the government, or to make any revolutionary changes to the city. On the contrary, they styled themselves as the true defenders of order and peace in New Orleans against the armed thuggery of the Know-Nothing mobs. Speaking of Know-Nothing mobs, by the afternoon of the 3rd of June, there had gathered an imposing assemblage of armed men in Lafayette Square outside City Hall. They were gathered in response to the Vigilance Committee and hoped to pressure the mayor into taking violent actions against them. Another case of irony was that the Know-Nothings had gathered in a square named after a foreign Frenchman, while the Vigilance Committee, who were mostly Creoles and immigrants, were gathered in a square named after Anglo-American hero Andrew Jackson. As the first day of the occupation dragged on, there was some friction within the city government on how to handle the situation. The city council, which had met in emergency session, proposed that the mayor should arm the people of New Orleans in an improvised militia to retake Jackson Square and the Cabildo by force. Mayor Waterman, on the other hand, who had by this point been alienated from his previous allies in the government, wanted to handle the situation diplomatically to avoid bloodshed. In response to this, the city council called for his resignation so that the more hardline Henry Summers could take his place and enact their plan. Waterman refused to resign, and so now there was a standoff, both in the streets and within the government. Finding no flexibility within the city council, Waterman decided to visit the headquarters of the Vigilance Committee. It was here that he received their relatively simple demand. They wanted to be sworn in as the special police that Superintendent Cotton was supposed to be overseeing so that the elections could proceed peacefully. Waterman told them that he had no authority to do this, and so the meeting went by without solving anything. However, after he met with the committee, Waterman decided to acquiesce to some of the city council's demands. He allowed the Know-Nothing mob outside of City Hall to be armed with both rifles and cannons, so that should things come to a head, they would be able to act as foot soldiers for the city government. It is important to take note here that the regular police force that should have been the ones tasked with protecting the city were proving to be completely ineffectual at this point. They made the pitiful gesture of issuing warrants of arrest for the committee leaders, but without the proper force to back these up, they were simply ignored. The next day, the 4th of June, Waterman vacillated again. This time, he decided to accept the demands of the committee and swear them in as a special police force that would act until after the election. It would have been a good decision if he had just done this the previous day, but now there was a well-armed mob of Know-Nothing supporters who staunchly opposed any such action. When they received news of Waterman's capitulation, they began forming ranks to attack Jackson Square, which they now dubbed Fort Vigilance. Luckily, the lack of organization within the mob caused them to get split up. Lacking a full force, when they encountered the barricades of Fort Vigilance, it was determined that they could not be able to follow through with their assault. They then promptly returned to Lafayette Square, where they then agreed to be disarmed. New Orleans had avoided a full-scale civil war by the skin of her teeth, But there was still bloodshed, as one know-nothing man was shot in the cheek by one of the committeemen, and a misfiring cannon at Fort Vigilance led to one man being injured and another killed. The worst of the bloodshed came when Fort Vigilance accidentally fired on one of their own patrols that was returning from scouting. This resulted in 4 deaths and 9 injuries. Although widespread conflict was avoided and the mob at Lafayette Square was disarmed, the situation remained heated. The Know-Nothings were still furious at Waterman for caving to the committee, and they kept a sizable mob outside City Hall to threaten him. Not feeling safe in City Hall, on the 5th of June, Waterman snuck out and made his way to Fort Vigilance, where he took up residence. The absence of Waterman at City Hall allowed the council to act unilaterally to revoke the appointment of the committee as a special police force. They then impeached Waterman and swore in Henry Summers as acting mayor. Summers immediately swore in 1,600 additional policemen, but did not make a move against Fort Vigilance. Instead, he allowed the situation to cool a little. By June the 6th, both sides had stopped agitating each other and an uneasy peace settled on the city. The Vigilance Committee maintained its presence at Jackson Square and kept themselves under arms, but they promised that they would only go to the polls if the city government asked them to. The following day, June the 7th, was Election Day, and perhaps because the committee was standing by, or perhaps because of the 1,600 new cops standing guard at the polls, the election went by without incident. Its results were an all-around victory for the Know-Nothings. Despite the fact that they were unable to strong-arm the voters at the ballot boxes, the lack of a cohesive opposition allowed them to win most of their races, including the all-important mayoral race. Stith won over Beauregard by a margin of 131 votes. Before dawn on the day after the election, the Vigilance Committee disbanded and left their fortifications in Jackson Square. It had been a tense 5 days in New Orleans, to say the least, but the city managed to avoid any cataclysmic violence. What is most striking about what has been erroneously dubbed the Know-Nothing Riot of 1858 was that its drama was juxtaposed by a more generalized disinterest in city politics. The violence that had accompanied the last few elections, the inability for the Know-Nothing administrations to fix the problems of the city, and the lack of an energetic opposition led to the large majority of citizens in New Orleans to simply check out of politics. While the Vigilance Committee and Know-Nothings faced off against each other, willing to kill one another, the rest of the populace went about their business, hardly paying any attention to the drama that was unfolding. After the elections of 1858, it seemed like the Know-Nothings had cemented their control over New Orleans completely. The administration of Stith was popular enough that it seemed like the elections of 1860 were a foregone conclusion. It would be another Know-Nothing sweep. That might have been true if events outside of New Orleans hadn't re-energized the electorate and completely shifted the political discussion in the city. In 1858, the events of the election were focused on local problems in New Orleans, those being violence against immigrants and election interference. In 1860, a national issue completely eclipsed any other discussion. This question will be the focus of the next half of this episode. That is, the question of secession. 1860 was the point of no return on the slavery issue. Debate over the continuation and expansion of slavery had kicked the can down the road since 1776. There had always been one more compromise, one more concession, one more distraction. We previously went over how 1846 was the beginning of some great upheaval and trouble in New Orleans, and it was likewise for the rest of the country. The annexation of Texas was a definitive line drawn in the sand that, once crossed, made the rupturing of the country all but inevitable. But it took time for enough pressure to build to cause such a catastrophic sundering, about 14 years to be exact. By 1859, the boundary of discussion wasn't whether a candidate for office supported the expansion of slavery or its restriction, it was whether he supported union or secession. The winner of the 1859 gubernatorial race in Louisiana, Thomas More, was an ardent secessionist. He stated in his inaugural address in January of 1860 that he believed the North was so committed to destroying the rights of slaveholders that it had awakened sentiments favorable to a separation of states. And this debate wasn't just a national or statewide issue, it bled into local politics, so that the mayoral race of 1860 wasn't about who was going to pave the roads or reform the police, but whether the candidate supported secession or union, an issue that they would have absolutely no say in if elected. When lesser political issues arise, we often see shifts in stances within parties, but one of the most obvious characteristics of a greater political issue is that it often causes even nominally cohesive parties to shed factions like a dog sheds hair in the summer. This had been the case for the Whigs in 1852, who had done more than shedding. They had completely imploded, with parts fleeing to either the Democrats, the Know-Nothings, or the Republicans. Now it was time for the Democrats to crack under the pressure of the secessionist movement. The Democratic National Convention in Charleston failed to come to an agreement on a presidential candidate. A second convention was called later in the year in Baltimore, where it finally agreed that they would put forward Stephen A. Douglas as the party's nominee. Douglas represented the default position of the Democratic Party up until this point, that the slavery issue should be decided by each state individually via popular referendum. This position, however, was out of date. The radical pro-slavery elements of the Democratic Party had moved away from the consensus and demanded a candidate who stood 10 toes down in support of slavery, no equivocation. These radicals met together under the name of Southern Democrats and nominated their own candidate, John Breckinridge. There were at this moment 3 major candidates running for president: Abraham Lincoln for the Republicans, John Breckinridge for the Southern Democrats, and Stephen Douglas for the Democratic Party. As if this wasn't enough of a mess already, there was a 4th contender who would soon enter the race. The Constitutional Union Party was formed by the flotsam of the Whig Party at the end of 1859, with the expressed purpose of sidestepping the slavery issue. Their platform wasn't so much anti-slavery or pro-slavery, but pro-union over pro-secession. They operated under a principle of, let's just agree to disagree and preserve the Union no matter what. Didn't they get the memo that slavery was the defining issue of the day? What the 1860 presidential election eventually came down to was 2 contests that divided the country on geographic lines. North of the Mason-Dixon line, Lincoln and Douglas duked it out over the northern states. The moderates up north supported Douglas for his pragmatic compromise over slavery, while the bulk of the population got behind Lincoln and the radical anti-slavery Republicans. Down south, Breckinridge and Constitutional Union candidate John Bell fought over the slaveholding states. This race was much closer than the one up north, with Breckinridge's radical pro-slavery platform winning just 1.8% more of the popular vote than John Bell's let's just ignore it and all get along platform. Notably for us, Louisiana went to Breckinridge, with Governor Moore and the state Democratic Party whipping the votes in his favor. However, he only won a plurality with 44.9% of the vote. Douglas and Bell got 15.1 and 40% of the vote respectively, and had the ticket not been split, it is likely that Louisiana would have gone to the Constitutional Union. This largely comes down to New Orleans and its surrounding parishes, where the Creole community in particular were reluctant to support the cause of secession. There was an understanding in the city that while the politically active elite were committed to the cause of slavery, the potential risk of splitting from the North was perhaps just as bad as the end of slavery. Truly, the city was caught between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, New Orleans relied on cotton and sugar plantations to provide the cash crops which fueled its economy. These in turn relied on slaves, which was the largest part of the New Orleans market at that time. On the other hand, New Orleans also relied on trade upriver with northern states like Ohio and Illinois. There was also a general understanding that the North would not accept secession, and this would invariably lead to civil war. If such a war did occur, it would be in the best interest of the North to cut off any trade connections the South had in order to starve them out. Taking New Orleans would be a key piece of this strategy. So the best scenario heading into the election of 1860 was the preservation of the Union with no changes made to slavery, meaning that the Constitutional Unionists were their best bet. That same year, there was a mayoral election, but this was relegated to the background, and John T. Monroe won by a huge margin under the American Party ticket. The American Party, also known as the Know-Nothings, were at this point a de facto wing of the Constitutional Union, but like I said before, the mayor of New Orleans really had no say in whether secession happened or not. Like the rest of the South, the presidential race in New Orleans came down to either Bell or Breckinridge. There was a fanatical energy in the city with regards to this contest, which contrasted greatly with the general apathy in regards to the municipal elections. All throughout the city, clubs and groups popped up in support of the two national candidates. With marches of uniformed men and political rallies with charismatic speakers, there was a real sense that the results of this election in New Orleans would determine the future in a way that no other before it had. In reality, the election in New Orleans, and the rest of the South for that matter, ended up not meaning squat. Even if either Bell or Breckinridge had won every single southern state, they would not have had enough electoral votes to beat Lincoln, who swept the North, winning over Douglas in every state except Missouri, to carry the election for the Republicans. The result of the presidential election of 1860 was a worst-case scenario for the slave-owning elites of New Orleans. Not only was the end of slavery now likely, secession was all but certain. The shock of Republican victory shook the divided Democrats of New Orleans out of the fantasy they had been living in. They quickly got over their differences and came together again, now under the banner of secession, of Confederacy. If union in slavery was no longer an option, it would have to be Confederacy in slavery. Things moved quickly in the winter of 1860-1861. In December, the state legislature passed a bill that called for a convention on the issue of secession to convene on January 23, 1861. To see how quickly attitudes shifted in New Orleans, the city's delegation to the convention was almost entirely pro-secession, despite the city leaning towards the Union just a few months before. This was echoed by other municipalities throughout the state, and even before the convening of the convention, its results were a foregone conclusion. Impatient to hear from the convention what they already knew to be fact, that Louisiana would secede from the Union, the military commanders in New Orleans acted in January to seize control of the state from the federal government. Battalions streamed out of New Orleans, heading up and down the river to capture important points of control along the Mississippi. This left New Orleans without many of its soldiers, and so the prominent citizens of the city called upon its residents to form impromptu home guards. It may be surprising to learn that these home guards were not made up of rich Anglo-American or Creole men who had the most obvious connection to the continuation of slavery that the Confederacy represented. Instead, one brigade was made up entirely of Frenchmen, while another 2 brigades were a mishmash of German, Irish, Dutch, English, and other immigrants who wanted to prove their loyalty to their new home by volunteering to defend it. They would even be joined in the spring of 1861 by a militia of free people of color, who surprisingly also swore to defend the Confederate States of America. Most of the men in these new companies came from the middle or even lower classes of New Orleans, but they were all commanded by aristocratic Creole officers. The elites of the city did not entirely trust these patriotic volunteers. However, ironically, the Confederate 1st Louisiana Native Guard would be the first military company in America to have non-white officers. These were the men who would man the city walls if New Orleans seceded and if the Union came knocking. And by January 10th, secession was all but confirmed. The brigades that had left New Orleans successfully took all the important fortified positions in the state without bloodshed and garrisoned them in the name of an independent Louisiana. By the time the convention finally got together on the 23rd, all they had to do was apply a rubber stamp to what was already clear on the ground. Despite the seeming inevitability of the situation, the Ordinance of Secession was not adopted unanimously. There were still some in the state who feared what secession would bring, the certainty of war, an invasion by a hostile army, and those who believed that the United States of America was a sacred idea that superseded any state loyalty. However, when it came down to signing the official bill of secession, many of those who had initially voted against it would sign it. It was former Governor Roman, a delegate to the convention, who laid out the idea that he and others believed secession to be a dangerous undertaking, but that he remained loyal to what the majority of the state wanted. Louisiana was the 6th of eventually 11 total states that would secede from the Union. Before the convention ended, they had one more point of order to take care of. Now that Louisiana was its own independent republic, it needed a new capital. Well, actually, it needed an old capital, as the convention decided to name New Orleans as the center of the Republic of Louisiana's governance. Many in New Orleans celebrated this change and the separation from the North, but support was not ubiquitous. All but one of the men elected to the United States Congress resigned from their posts. This one holdout was a Creole man who represented the French Quarter of New Orleans, who held neither sentiment towards the secession movement nor illusions to how this whole affair would end. While many of his constituents, including other prominent Creoles, lit fireworks and fired off cannons to celebrate the momentous occasion, the sole Louisiana representative left in the House somberly braced himself for the reckoning New Orleans would receive. Even though Louisiana had taken the monumental step of separating itself from the United States, it had not decided whether it would join a partnership of the other seceded states yet. It is often taken for granted that the South would coalesce into the Confederacy, but in January of 1861, it was still under debate. Now that New Orleans was the capital, it would become the center for this debate. The majority argued for an immediate joining of the rebellious states. However, a significant minority was apprehensive towards this prospect. It seemed that it had just dawned on a few members of the government in Louisiana that there might be consequences for secession. They didn't want to rejoin the Union, besides at this point that would be next to impossible, but if they kept from joining a Confederacy, then they could have full control over negotiations with the United States. Perhaps war could be avoided if they managed to strike a deal with their former countrymen. In the end, the sentiment that the southern states should all hang together, or they would surely hang alone, prevailed, and on February 8, 1861, Louisiana and the other rebellious states formed the Confederate States of America. Other notable actions taken at the same Congress that formed the Confederacy was the order to seize the federal mint in New Orleans and the designation of Richmond, Virginia as the country's capital. We might ask ourselves why New Orleans, the largest and wealthiest city in the Confederacy, was not given the honor as its capital. It comes down to a few reasons. One was that New Orleans was rich in trade and luxury goods, while Richmond was more of an industrial center, producing finished goods that would be important to the Confederate war effort. Another reason was that Virginia was an important political symbol. It had been the most important colony during the American Revolution, and since the Confederacy wanted to paint themselves as the proper inheritors of that legacy, it made sense to center themselves around Virginia. A third reason was that as you moved further north in the Confederacy, the loyalty to the rebels lessened. This was made evident by the fact that northwestern part of Virginia was so against secession that it broke off from the state to stay in the Union as the state of West Virginia. The hope was that by locating the capital in the northern part of the South, that it would entice any remaining fence-sitters to join the Confederate side. The final reason was that Richmond was in a good defensible position. It seems like the minority of New Orleanians were not the only ones that noticed how vulnerable the city was to Union invasion. The winter of 1860-1861 was one of both great upheaval and anticipation for even greater change. There was a period of 2 months between when South Carolina became the first state to secede and when the Confederacy was officially born. It would be another 2 months until the next sensational event shook the country. During this 4-month period, New Orleans remained obstinate in its commitment to letting the good times roll. Even as militias and armies were being recruited to serve in the predictable war, New Orleans was partying and celebrating. This wasn't just a time of foreboding, it was carnival season, it was Mardi Gras. The opera house and the dance halls remained filled to the rafters with music and revelry. Then, on April 14th, the illusion was shattered. In South Carolina, forces under the command of Brigadier General Beauregard, Louisiana native and recent candidate for mayor of New Orleans, fired upon the Union garrison at Fort Sumter. In the preceding 4 months, federal land had been seized by the rebels without bloodshed or violence, including, as we mentioned, forts in Louisiana and the Mint in New Orleans. However, this was mostly due to the fact that the U.S. government was being headed by a lame duck Democratic president, James Buchanan. Once Abraham Lincoln was sworn into office on March 4, 1861, the official policy became not a step back. As any graduate of the American public school system knows, this led to the standoff at Fort Sumter, which, once taken by force by Beauregard's Confederates, ignited the Civil War. The reception to the news of the capture of Fort Sumter in New Orleans was mixed. There had still been some who deluded themselves into thinking that the split between the Union and the Confederacy would be amicable. Others were aghast that Americans would soon be killing other Americans. But for now, the majority still remained in the camp of chauvinistic nationalist zeal. It was an honor to these supporters of the war in New Orleans that the first blow had been struck by a local hero, Beauregard, and they looked forward to fighting the tyrannical Yankees. 5 days after the battle at Fort Sumter, President Lincoln signed an order to establish a blockade of the Confederacy. This blockade would be carried out by around 500 Union ships, which covered over 3,500 miles of coastline. Their goal was twofold: prevent the South from selling its raw goods, primarily cotton, and prevent war materials from entering the South from foreign markets. They were largely successful on the first point, reducing the cotton exports from the South to only 5% of what it had been before the war. On the other front, they were less successful. European, primarily British, guns and ammunition managed to sneak past the blockade and kept the South, who lacked an industrial base to rival the North, to maintain its military capacity well past the expected date. The blockade was the first scratch on the romantic veneer the pro-war camp in New Orleans put on the Civil War. Before ships were being seized and trade was halted, the war had seemed like a far-off thing, an adventure for the young boys to earn glory and a way to show the honor and pride of Louisiana. Now it was a serious threat to the city, to its trade, and to its people. Yet still the majority of New Orleanians remained supporters of the war. Even as 1861 dragged on and the blockade tightened and news of Ulysses S. Grant preparing for a march down the Mississippi reached the city, most of its residents enthusiastically contributed to the Confederate cause. By the 1st of May, there were new companies of young men marching off to war almost every day, and the community raised donations to outfit their sons, fathers, and husbands. To keep morale up and keep the stream of fresh grist for the war mill flowing out of the city, religious and political leaders held rallies where they gave fiery and passionate speeches about the need to defend the liberties of their families from the despotism of the North, and evoked the spirit of 1776 to fight for the same principles their forefathers had. To be clear, although most of the relatives of the Creole community had fought on the American side of the War of Independence, they had mostly been fighting under a Spanish flag for Spanish territorial ambition, not freedom and democracy. The rhetoric was effective, though, and even after 2 months of recruitment, New Orleans had not yet exhausted her supply of manpower. There was a limiting factor that did come into play here, though, one that restricted the number of soldiers the city could field. That factor was racism. There were many free people of color in Louisiana, and especially in New Orleans, who felt a strong sense of loyalty to the state and the Confederacy, despite the fact that secession and the Civil War were direct actions in defense of the enslavement of black people. The black volunteers of the Confederate Army did not see it this way. They believed that they owed their livelihoods to the state, and they believed that service in the army was a way to defeat the racial boundaries by showing that people of color were just as invested in the ideals of the American dream as white people were. The Confederacy did not agree on this point. They allowed the formation of black battalions, but they refused to send them to fight or to represent the Confederacy in public military parades. Had the Confederates not been so dismissive of the free black community's willingness to fight, they would have had many more men on hand to defend New Orleans. As it was by February of 1862, the manpower reserves of the city were finally stripped. Fresh soldiers weren't the only thing the city was lacking at this point. When the blockade first appeared in April of 1861, there was a vague idea in the minds of New Orleanians that the war would mean a certain tightening of the belt and a lack of the luxury European goods that had previously flowed into the city. It wasn't until the end of July that year that the full scope of the Union's Anaconda Plan was realized. The strangulation of the South was in full effect by July, and the lack of commerce in New Orleans prompted the Confederate government to close the banks. Prices on essential goods like food and clothing began rising, and the city had to take steps to prevent the citizenry from panicking. A free market was established that gave out much-needed supplies to 2,000 poor families twice a week. Private citizens, those wealthy enough to not have to rely on the free market, established charitable organizations to support the families of Confederate soldiers who had left for the front lines. There was still a sense of patriotic duty among the elite of New Orleans, even under such dire economic circumstances. This spirit of loyalty was exploited by Mayor Monroe to maintain popular support for his administration. Shortly after the beginning of the war, it was made clear that a blockade of the southern ports was just one step in the Union's plan to strangle the Confederacy. The major next step was to capture the most important port, that being New Orleans. To this end, Union troops began gathering on Ship Island off the coast of Mississippi, just east of New Orleans. It was well understood that this force was gathering for an eventual invasion of the Crescent City. Monroe capitalized on this by arresting alleged Union spies in New Orleans and putting them on public trial. This crackdown on espionage benefited Monroe in two ways. One, it bolstered his image among the patriotic citizens as a loyal defender of Confederate liberty. Additionally, it gave him carte blanche to arrest and prosecute a suspected network of spies in New Orleans, who were in reality the gangs of violent know-nothings that had terrorized the streets of New Orleans for the past 8 years. There had never been any charges that were able to stick on this group of troublemakers, but now Monroe could simply label them all as seditious Union actors and round them all up. It was a genius, if not a little underhanded tactic. But no matter how many know-nothings Monroe arrested, it did not remove the fact that there was a very serious threat to the safety of the city that was gathering strength just across the water. On the 21st of February, 1862, power in New Orleans was transferred from the municipal city council to an unelected committee of public safety. Less than a month later, this committee, in tandem with Major General Mansfield Lovell, declared martial law in New Orleans in anticipation that the attack from Ship Island was finally coming. It had been just over a year since Louisiana seceded from the Union, and now the reckoning was coming for New Orleans. The situation on the ground when martial law was declared in March was this. The Union Army, tasked with taking Confederate strongholds on the Mississippi River, was loitering in southern Tennessee, waiting to muster its full strength and set out down the river. A small-scale and bloodless naval battle in October of 1861 saw the Union blockade near the mouth of the Mississippi routed by a scrappy Confederate raiding party. This gave the military commanders and civilians in New Orleans a false sense of security that was quickly dashed in January of 1862 when the blockade resumed in force. Despite the closeness of this blockade and the knowledge that Union forces were amassing on Ship Island, the Confederate leadership in Richmond and their agents in New Orleans believed that an invasion of the city would come over land from the north. At this point, Grant's Union Army was about 400 miles away from New Orleans in Tennessee, while the naval blockade was about 70 miles downriver. It should have been clear to anyone with a map where their most immediate threat to the city was. Yet still, the belief was that the southern flank was secure, that the Union could not possibly invade from downriver. We can thank the Battle of New Orleans in 1815 for this belief. In 1815, the twin forts of Jackson and St. Philip held off the British Navy from sailing up the river and taking New Orleans. But that had been almost 50 years ago. The British were sailing in wooden ships powered by wind. This was the year 1862. The Union had ironclad ships powered by steam and carrying more powerful guns. In February, the last of the expected troops arrived on Ship Island. Now all the Union had to do was wait for favorable weather to begin their assault. On the flip side, New Orleans was ludicrously undermanned and undergunned. Over the last year, it had sent over 20,000 of its 168,000 population to fight up north in Mississippi. This constituted nearly the entire military-age white male population in the city. These men had carried out with them many of the cannons and mortars that would have normally been used to protect the city. Too late, the commander in charge of New Orleans' defenses, General Lovell, realized how dire the situation was. Lovell had at his disposal 3,000 armed men, while the invasion force on Ship Island numbered 15,000 under the command of General Benjamin Butler. Lovell placed every available gun and man he had in Forts Jackson and St. Philip, and pleaded with the Confederate government to send reinforcements. They reassured him that he had nothing to worry about, and that surely the real threat to the city was the 500,000-strong Union Army amassing 400 miles south. By late March, the standoff between Butler and Lovell created a thick atmosphere of anxiety in New Orleans. No longer did the general populace believe that they were truly safe. Lovell himself was convinced that an attack was imminent, but he was not sure exactly where this would occur. He placed all his eggs in the Jackson and St. Philip basket, but was made uneasy by the fact that Butler had performed minor expeditions on the Mississippi coast to test his troops' readiness. These expeditions made Lovell think about the possibility that the Union would circumvent his fortifications to flank the city from the north. Whatever the case, though, Lovell did not have the manpower necessary to cover all angles, and spreading out his forces would guarantee a defeat no matter where the attack came from, so he remained in his forts, now a little more uneasy. To make matters worse, in the first week of April, the Confederate forces under the command of General Beauregard, many of whom were from New Orleans, engaged General Grant's Union army at Shiloh. The casualty rates of this battle were horrific compared to anything Americans had witnessed in any war up to this point. It would eventually be overshadowed by the sheer bloodiness of the rest of the Civil War. The Battle of Shiloh was a draw casualty-wise, with both sides suffering similar losses, but the Confederate army was eventually routed, which struck a huge blow to the morale of the entire Confederacy, especially New Orleans. The Confederacy had fooled itself into believing that they could hold out against the Union in limited engagements, and that the North would eventually lose interest in fighting an offensive war in enemy territory, and concede to just letting the South split away. The battle at Shiloh proved not only that the Union was willing and able to spill unprecedented amounts of blood in the pursuit of reuniting the nation, but also that it was in the dominant position in the Western theater. As news of the battle trickled into New Orleans, along with hundreds of wounded New Orleanians, the atmosphere of anxiety turned into one of dread. Just over a week after Shiloh, the scouts at Fort Jackson spotted Union ironclads steaming their way into mortar range. On April 17th, the operation to take New Orleans began with a bombardment at Fort Jackson. Ironically, among the Union ships firing on the fort, there were two vessels named Richmond, after the Confederate capital, and Jackson, named after Andrew Jackson, just like the fort. The duel between the Union fleet and the two forts was remarkably inconclusive. The fleet was anchored on the river about 1.5 miles away from Fort Jackson, which was their primary target, as the commander of the Union Navy expected that once Jackson, the fort, not the ship, was taken, that St. Philip would also capitulate. The first day of action saw the Union fire over 2,000 shells into Fort Jackson, which surprisingly did very little effective damage. On the Confederate side of things, a lack of rifled guns and an overabundance of faulty powder meant that the forts were unable to reach the fleet, except for one 7-inch gun. The next day was more of the same. Lots of shells fired, not much of substance achieved. The Union forces did, however, obtain some useful knowledge. Under the cover of night, they managed to sneak closer to the forts without being spotted. When they did this, they discovered that the major roadblock the Confederates had constructed, a cable spanning the width of the river that would stop any ship from steaming past the forts, was vulnerable. On the 19th, the artillery duel resumed, this time accompanied by a rainstorm. The night of the 19th was a perfect opportunity for the Union forces. The rain and the darkness made visibility from the forts non-existent, and so they snuck back up the river to the cable and cut it. With the cable gone and unable to be replaced, the Confederate commander at Fort Jackson knew that it was only a matter of time before the Union would make their final drive up the river to take New Orleans. The only reason they had not done so already was that sailing past the forts would obviously bring the fleet within the range of their shorter-range guns. Either those would have to be silenced by a long-range barrage, or they would have to wait for them to run out of ammunition. For 4 more days, the same routine that had been going on since the 17th continued, with both sides now running lower and lower on ammunition, and no progress being made. Still, time was on the Union side as the Confederates had no effective way to block the route upriver. What the Union didn't know was that time was not actually on their side. See, the Confederacy was actually hoping to drag the duel out so that they would have time to finish constructing the ironclad Louisiana. Once completed, the ship could be sailed down the battlefield and serve as a third fort, effectively ending any hope the Union invasion had of sailing past Jackson and St. Philip. On April 23rd, the Louisiana, still not quite in tip-top shape, limped her way down the river to take position just above Fort St. Philip. This was done just in time, as in the early morning hours of April 24th, the Union began its run past the forts. It is not necessary to go into full detail the course of this operation, so we should just make note that it resembled the artillery duel in the way that it was a lot of drama and noise that ultimately resulted in little damage and few casualties. It did, however, result in success for the Union side. As the fleet steamed up the river, it exchanged heavy fire with Forts St. Philip and Jackson, as well as the Louisiana. While the Confederates made a valiant effort and managed to stop a few vessels from making it past them, in the end, the bulk of the Union fleet steadily sailed past the New Orleans line of defense at the plodding pace of 4 miles an hour. The Louisiana, for all her promise as the savior of the defense, was unable to contribute significant enough firepower to deter the Union. She was, however, well armored enough that all attempts to silence her simply bounced harmlessly off her Ironsides. By the time the sun set on April the 24th, the 7-day operation was over. Between the two sides, 17,000 shells had been fired. The total number of casualties, both killed and wounded, numbered less than 200. The two forts were largely intact, with only superficial damage that could be quickly repaired. The Louisiana remained operational, and her captain prepared to re-engage the enemy. The forts refused to surrender to the Union commander, but the invasion force was now clear of their guns and had a free path to New Orleans, the ultimate prize of the expedition. Next time, we will go over the surrender of the city and the military occupation of New Orleans, so please join me in the next episode for the history of New Orleans.